So, hi everyone, it's Bob Morus, the founder of Phelps Creek, and I'm with Bill Swain, my winemaker, and this is the first podcast we're doing about wine in the time of COVID. And so we're going to have a great time talking about how Bill and I met over 30 years ago, and we're going to go through the wines of your wine club package. In fact, we may have a few surprises along the way. Bill and I go back a long ways. I'm going to ask Bill about when, so the history of the gorge is really interesting. I mean, you start with the Missoula floods, and then you go, to when the Chinook tribe of Indians are catching salmon on the Celilo Falls. Then you have Lewis and Clark that come through, and some years after that you got Simon Benson and Sam Hill building the Columbia Gorge Highway, and then like the next significant action is Bill Swain comes into the Columbia Gorge.
That's right. I started it all.
So Bill, tell us about when you came into the gorge and what was the dream and what you were thinking about.
Well, in 1977, I was doing let me yell. In 1977, I was doing a tour of everything north of the Napa Valley, looking for a place to maybe open up my little winery and vineyard in some place that I could afford. So I checked out Northern California and Southern Oregon, and talked to Dave Lett in the Willamette Valley, and then my next stop was going to be out towards Yakima, but on the way to there I wanted to stop at this place that was a little interesting looking in the middle of the Columbia River Gorge, because there was a winery in Bingen, Washington, across from Hood River, and it was the only winery producing in this area here. So I stopped in there and talked to Chuck Henderson, who was doing Bingen Wine Cellars, later Montelise Winery after his daughter Elise, and he was very generous and helpful and tasted wines, and I saw a lot of potential. And in the process of doing this, of course, I opened my eyes, looked around, and saw all this spectacular beauty here, and I was just taken in by it all. So this was summer of 1977.
Well, what were the grapes that you were focused on at that time?
Well, my favorite grape, and still continues to be maybe, is Riesling. And but I had not that long ago started to fall in love with Pinot Noir, Burgundies, and of course not very many people at that time could afford to drink very much Burgundy out of France, because it was and remains very expensive for the quality you get. But Oregon was just starting, especially with David Lett, to produce some very nice, very challenging to the French Pinot Noirs. So that piqued my interest, and all of a sudden that became part of the plan.
So, I think with Lett, the 74, the 75 was the famous South Block Judgment.
I don't
Paris
remember the
wine.
year, but it was about then, yes.
So that's right about the time that he had just gotten some attention on that.
Exactly. And that was, things were written up in newspapers that made it all the way down to California, so I was aware of him. So he was on my list of people to stop and talk to.
So when did you actually put plants into the ground?
Well, 77 was just finding out this is the place. Then it was finding some property. That didn't actually happen until early spring of 1978. We had some real estate people working on that for us. So I moved up here, I think June of 1978. And my first challenge was to work with the contractor on clearing a property site like you did, but not as extensive, and start building a house.
And where was the location?
Up in Underwood.
Oh, so Underwood is where Well, actually, the first wine in our glass is mostly grown on Underwood Mountain because we have this 2017 Pinot Gris, where we have a tiny bit of Pinot Gris here on the vineyard on what we call the lower east slope. There's a few rows of that, but most of what we grow over in Underwood Mountain.
For that variety, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're on the other side of the river in Washington for that grape.
And that is, I think, by everybody's assumption, probably a really good area to grow the cool climate white grape varieties. So we get really nice Riesling from there, Pinot Gris, Gewürztraminer, and that's true. But my intention was to do Riesling and Pinot Noir, so that's what I planted in my vineyard. But I didn't actually, after building the house 1 year, the next year was clearing land, and it wasn't until 1980 that I started putting plants in the ground.
Okay. And so here, the first year, so it was about 10 years before we had plants in the ground in Phelps Creek.
Yes.
So, well, that brings us to a good moment to talk about this Pinot Gris. So let's taste a nice sip. I mean, one thing about Bill makes the Pinot Gris is we go for, I think, really nice acid balance.
Well, we don't have to work at it. It just comes that way. So that's what we get out of Underwood.
And, you know, quite often I know what we've done with our estate Pinot Gris is we've done some of it in barrel. And sometimes we blend a little bit of the barrel aged Pinot Gris into the stainless. What are we trying to achieve when we do that?
Well, if we're doing that, and no more than, say, 25%, I think that's the most we've ever done, then it's to try to give it a little bit more acid balance, because we get the crisper acidity from Underwood, we get more of the richness from the vineyard over here.
And I think even a little more mouthfeel. I mean, it feels bigger in the mouth. Well, that's great. So when you did that, did you end up having a tasting room over there on Underwood?
Well, it took a while, but I was at 84 or 85 we started getting enough grapes that we're wanting to do something with it other than trial batches. And it occurred to me, as it might to most people who have lived here for a while, that there's a lot more traffic on the Oregon side with the I-84 freeway than there is on the Washington side with two-lane State Route 14.
Yeah.
So I started looking over in Hood River for a good place with good visibility and access to do the winery and the tasting room, and that's what I found over here in Hood River, even though the vineyard was over in Underwood across the river in a different state. And this was prior to having the AVAs and everything else. So these were Washington grapes made in Oregon. Everything was a little bit loosey-goosey back then as to how you were required to label everything if there was no AVA in place.
But now we have an AVA, so we have the Columbia Gorge AVA. So you could actually, which is what we have done in this bottle, is combine some Oregon Pinot Gris with some Washington Pinot Gris, and the state doesn't show up on the label. It's called Columbia Gorge.
Just Columbia Gorge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, geographically, by state, we've got this artificial line that runs down the Columbia River, but by the way of nature, we're all the same place. So.
All the same place. It's more about, in my mind, more about where we are from west to east than it is from where we are north to south.
Correct.
So what would you choose to eat with and pair with this Pinot Gris?
Wow. Well, other than just enjoying it to sip, I really like it with white pasta dishes, poultry, things like that. I think are my favorite things with food. Maybe some types of fish, not salmon, but the lighter fish dishes.
Yeah, when people have said, like, if it's fish in a cream sauce, then it goes with Pinot Gris, and if it's fish grilled well, then it's moved in Oregon towards Pinot Noir. But I think that's a pretty good adage. So. Well, all that has made me thirsty for the second wine. And our second wine is going to be Cordovois, or corduroy is what we call it now. And so corduroy is a white wine made from Pinot Noir. And probably the most famous white wine of Pinot Noir, or Blanc Noir, would be a component or the wine that's going to form a lot of champagne. So it's a white wine made from red grapes. And I know the story about how it first came about, but Bill can tell us a little bit about how we actually make that wine.
Well, we make two wines out of the same grapes, and we pick a selection of Pinot Noir grapes, less ripe than we would pick them if we were making regular barrel-aged Pinot Noir Burgundy style red wine. And so we pick these grapes a little bit less ripe, and we put them in directly into our wine press without destemming or crushing, and then we just break the skins on them so the juice starts to flow, and the first 30% of the juice that flows out without any pressing becomes corduroy. And then we leave those same grapes in the wine press and allow them to soak and pick up color and additional flavor from the skins, and we press that, and at this point, instead of coming out clear, it comes out pink, and that becomes our rosé, our fleur de noir.
Because all the color, if I got this right, from the wine is really coming from the skins.
Almost all, especially in Pinot Noir. There are some grapes where even the pulp of the grape will have it's sometimes a lot of color, but usually a little bit of color, like Cabernet Sauvignon, for instance. The pulp is pinkish color, even though the skins are dark.
Well, I can remember how this wine first came to Phelps Creek. As many of you know, Alexandrine Roy joins our team each year from Gevrey-Chambertin, and Alexandrine was out with me on a sales call into Portland. We were promoting our wines in between the fall harvest, and Alexandrine, we're in the Hawthorne district of, which is kind of a funky district of Portland, and we're driving around there going to a couple of major accounts, and Alexandrine says, Bob, I know how to make this Blanc Noir that some other wineries were making, and it's really quite simple. I think we could add that and make this wine. And I start laughing, and she says, well, what's so funny? And I said, well, we already make fleur de noir, which is our rosé, the flower of the king, and Alexandrine's last name is Roy. And I said, so we'll call this one Cordovois, or corduroy in English, and which it means the heart of the king, but in our case, in my mind, it was referring to the corduroy pants. It was kind of a funny thing, and so that's why I was laughing. She goes, oh, you make fun of my name. And I had to point out to her that some of her friends are very they think it's very funny to call their wine Clos Électrique, which means the electric fence, and she thinks that's quite witty. And I said this would just be another example of something that's quite funny. So we started making, I think in 2009 or 10, we started making that wine. I think 10 is the first year, because we've been drinking some of these 10s, and certain things struck me about this wine, and one is that it ages so beautifully.
And part of that is what we didn't continue on about, is the processing that goes on after we get this clear juice out.
So we get the juice out. What do we do with the wine then?
At that point, we basically treat it like a Burgundy style Chardonnay. So it goes directly into barrels. We add yeast and let it ferment in the barrels, and then we store it and age it on the yeast in the barrels, And in the case of the corduroy, we use either new or 1-year-old French oak barrels to give it the richness and the fullness, along with that whole process that ends up being this wine.
Well, I know we only do 2 barrels a year, so this wine is incredibly rare, and we like it as such because it's very special. I have served it at wine dinners where I don't reveal what it is and have the guests try to figure that out, and it's like a great parlor game at a dinner because it looks like Chardonnay, but it has the texture of Pinot Noir, and it has kind of this really unique Mediterranean spice backbone to it. It's really quite lovely, and every year this thing just moves like crazy, and people clamor for the next vintage. So this is the 2015 is what we're drinking right now. We don't try to rush it out, and we still have a little bit of 2010 in the cellar. In fact, I remember just a year ago or so I was saying I wonder if our style had changed and we were making this wine any differently, or it was coming out differently, and we did a vertical. We did 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and we tasted through the wines, and whereas we could detect a little bit of difference due to age, we detected no difference due to style.
I think the styles stayed, there's vintage differences, but within that, I think very close, similar style from year to year.
Yep. Well, since this is wine in the time of COVID, I'm going to do an interruption to show you. We're going through social distancing here. Normally Bill and I drink and we're a lot closer in the family room, but here our vineyard is set up. This is the homestead block looking at Mount Hood, and the rows are 8 feet apart. So right now, well, when I'm leaning, I guess we're at 7 feet, but we're keeping our 6-foot distance as we go through these wines. Let's move on to our first red wine, which is the Le Petit 2019. And this is really appropriate for this particular where we're tasting right now, because here we are in the homestead block looking at Mount Hood, and this Dijon 115 clone is typically, this block is the first that we pick, and for the Le Petit we pick it from this particular block here. So this is a very unique Pinot. Bill, why don't you tell us about how we make this?
Well, we use our own twist on the Beaujolais method of doing a Beaujolais Nouveau, which involves something called, in French, maceration carbonique, or in English, carbonic maceration. Sounds better in French, maybe. But it's we put whole cluster grapes into tanks that have been flooded with carbon dioxide, and then we pick the grapes again, as we do for the rosé and for the corduroy, a little bit early, because we're not looking for a lot of alcohol, and so lower sugar, and then we allow the grapes to sit in there uncrushed, the berries as many whole berries as we can, for 9 to 10 days. And during this time, there's this enzymatic fermentation that happens within the berry that doesn't involve yeast. And then the closest thing I can relate this to, maybe what other people have noticed in their lives, is if you've ever bought a really ripe pineapple and you haven't opened it or anything, but all of a sudden it's starting to smell like it's turning into beer or something. That's because it's doing a enzymatic fermentation inside the fruit, not involving yeast. So that's what we're looking for to happen inside the berries, and it only ferments to about 4 or 5% alcohol, and then that's all it will do. So following that period of time, then the grapes we stomp the grapes down and crush as many of the berries as we can. We do add yeast at this time and let the fermentation go on until the sugar level is down to about 6 to 8% sugar, and then we press it. No time in barrels, only in tanks. And
So
voila.
this wine never touched the barrel, was completely stainless.
Correct.
And now, when I taste it, I get that classic carbonic. It's like Smucker's strawberry jam. I mean, I'm picking up
like that, yeah.
the scent of strawberries, which is not something that you normally get in Pinot Noir.
No. A little bit of cinnamon too, I think.
Oh yeah. No, it's very fun. This we like to serve perhaps a little cool. So when it gets warm outside, we like to actually put this on top of the ice. Don't serve it warm. And it's meant to be served young and fresh, and you know, I'm hoping that everything we have is gone and in people's hands and they've had it all summer long. What's remarkable is we go back and we taste 2009s, 2010s when we started making this wine, and they're still tasting lovely. They taste more like they had a little bit of barrel time in them, but they're still very nicely structured. But this is really meant for a summer sipping wine.
I think the charm that it has is best, to me, best enjoyed when it's very young. So I call it a spring wine. So we're almost spring, so now's the time, in my opinion.
Oh, very good. And so let's move on to our next wine, which is a 2013 Columbia Gorge Pinot Noir. Now, this is 100% estate, grown right here on the slopes that you're seeing. It's all three of our clones. So at Phelps Creek, we have the Polmard clone, the Dijon 115, in fact, right here in front of us, and then Dijon 777 in different little pockets of the vineyard. And this is so perhaps the most balanced representation of all the different clones that we have. Don't get back up, not within 6 feet.
I thought it was 4 bottle lengths.
So the 13 vintage was such a fascinating vintage to me. You know, it was we had a little bit of we had a lot of pressure from humidity and such during the season, and just as we were about ready to pick, we had some rains came through, and the rains split some berries in certain portions of the vineyard especially. So when we did pick, we had gone through beforehand and we had dropped off that fruit. We had snipped it and just let it fall to the floor of the vineyard of those grapes that we didn't think were worthy of going through processing. That was probably a mistake. I look back at those times now, and I should have picked it, and I should have made a big bonfire and burnt it, because that those grapes on the ground kind of contributed to a lot of fruit flies that particular year.
Yes.
So it was like the year of fruit flies like locusts.
But it wasn't just us. I think it was
Everybody.
out in the orchards around us, and the people in the Willamette Valley were complaining about the same thing.
You're right. We actually
years.
heard about it later in the debrief when people talk about that vintage. It was the same for everyone. And but what it made for was a wine that had this beautiful lift and balance to it. Had very nice acidity to the wine. When we got through that, it was the remnants of a Pacific typhoon that hit Oregon. And when we got through that time, and we got to the backside where we had kind of an Indian summer, the grapes came off beautifully. We were just battling the fruit flies. So this wine right now is tasting like a very nice, aged, mature.
Right, and I think our 2013 Pinot Noirs, and a lot of people other than ourselves would agree, we did a lot better than almost everybody else with the wines from that year. We got a lot of really nice scores when everybody else were getting in the mid 80s.
Yeah, yeah. No, it did. It did very nice, and we don't have very much of it, so it was nice for the team to decide to pull some out of the archive and share it this particular time. So, I mean, I get all of that earthiness that's kind of classic to our site. Savory flavors. There's kind of this pendulum between sweet fruit and savory fruit. The Phelps Creek style is always towards savory.
And of course now with 7 years of age on it, it's starting to get that famous Burgundian silkiness about it, which is really delightful.
Yeah, it's very nice. I might just pause here for a while. But yet there's more. We have another special wine. And our wine, our surprise pour that wasn't in the wine club package, but is a very unique wine for us, is, what's the vintage on this? 2014 Homestead. So the Homestead wine is different. It's related to Le Petit, but Bill, tell us how this is different.
As I recall, this is what we made from the press wine?
The press?
Yes, okay. So this was our very first wine that we've labeled Homestead. The Homestead grapes have typically gone into Le Petit and picked early for that. But then I mentioned before how we go through the process of doing the maceration carbonique, followed by the regular yeast fermentation, and then we press the wine when it still has sugar in it, because we don't want it to extract a lot of tannin into the Le Petit. But then after we're through doing the light press, which goes into the Le Petit, we have this stronger press which comes after that, a much smaller amount, but enough to do 2 barrels of what we call, at the time we called it Le Petit press wine. And it turned out to be rather remarkable. So remarkable that Bob and I, instead of just putting it in with the Columbia Gorge blend, we bottled it separately as Homestead.
Well, so this is 115 clone, aged in barrel, and what I'm getting now, and I'm starting to get that smell of leather, which is the sign of a maturity in Pinot Noir. You know, we got all the other flavors, but we're starting to pick up a little of that, well, catcher's mitt sometimes is what I call it, but it really, that's for the little kid that was in Little League, and when he's bored out there in center field, he's chewing on his mitt. Anyway, it smells lovely. It still has a lot of fruit. It still has a lot of life, and it really represents what we are doing right here in the Homestead block. So I hope you have enjoyed our little podcast today, and I hope you are staying safe and healthy at home and drinking a lot of wine.
Absolutely.